At his peak, Napoleon Bonaparte directly ruled or controlled territories containing roughly 80 million people, nearly half the population of Europe. He fought over 60 major engagements and won the vast majority of them. He remade the map of the continent not once but 3 times. The legal code he wrote in 1804 is still the foundation of law in France, in Louisiana, in Quebec, and in dozens of countries across Latin America and Africa. He is the reason the metric system exists. He is the reason the modern civil service exists. He is, in ways most people never stop to consider, one of the principal architects of the world you live in right now. And yet 15 years before any of this, he was nobody. A 24-year-old artillery officer from Corsica, an island France had only purchased the year he was born, speaking French with a foreign accent, with no connections, no money, and no particular reason to believe history would remember him at all. How does that man become that emperor? That is the question this documentary sets out to answer. And the answer, it turns out, tells us something remarkable about power, revolution, and why some ideas refuse to die even when the men who carried them do. On the 15th of August, 1769, a child was born in Ajaccio, a sun-bleached port town on the island of Corsica. His mother, Letizia, was barely 20 years old. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a minor nobleman of Italian descent, a man of modest means and grand ambitions. They named the boy Napoleon. He was their second surviving child, and few on that rocky, wind-swept island could have imagined what he would become. The timing of his birth was, in the most literal sense, an accident of history. Just 1 year earlier, in 1768, the Republic of Genoa had sold Corsica to France. The island's proud inhabitants had fought bitterly for their independence under the nationalist leader Pasquale Paoli, but French military force had crushed that resistance just 3 months before Napoleon drew his first breath. He was Corsican by culture, French by the stroke of a pen, and Italian by ancestry. From the very beginning, he belonged fully to no single world. Carlo Bonaparte was a shrewd man. Recognizing that French citizenship opened doors that Corsican identity could not, he secured royal scholarships for his sons. In 1779, at 9 years old, Napoleon was sent to the military preparatory school at Brienne-le-Château in northeastern France. He arrived speaking barely a word of French, his accent thick, his clothes unfashionable, his family name foreign and strange on French tongues. His classmates mocked him relentlessly. He responded the only way he knew how, with fierce, solitary determination. He was not the most gifted student in every subject, but in mathematics he was exceptional, and mathematics was the language of artillery. While other boys dreamed of cavalry charges and the glamour of the sword, Napoleon was drawn to something more calculated, more precise. Artillery was the science of war, the discipline that rewarded intelligence over birthright. In 1784, he was admitted to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, one of the finest military academies in Europe. He completed in 1 year a course normally requiring 2. In 1785, at just 16 years old, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the French artillery regiment La Fère. But the young officer carried something beyond military training. He had devoured the great Enlightenment thinkers Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, filling notebook after notebook with his own reflections on history, politics, and power. He wrote a passionate history of Corsica. He dreamed of liberating the island entirely. Here was a young man shaped by displacement and sharpened by ridicule, armed with a technical mastery of the most destructive weaponry of his age, and burning with ideas about what a nation could be. France, in the years ahead, would give him the perfect opportunity to test every one of those ideas. By the summer of 1789, France was a kingdom eating itself alive. The treasury was empty, the harvest had failed, and bread prices in Paris had climbed beyond what ordinary working families could bear. King Louis XVI, well-meaning but profoundly indecisive, had convened the Estates General for the first time in 175 years, hoping somehow to resolve a fiscal crisis that had been decades in the making. Instead, he had opened a door he could never close again. On the 14th of July, 1789, a Paris crowd stormed the Bastille fortress, a prison that had come to symbolize royal tyranny. The walls fell in an afternoon. Within weeks, the old order, the ancient regime that had governed France for centuries, was dissolving with shocking speed. Aristocratic privileges were abolished in a single night of parliamentary frenzy. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was proclaimed. Louis XVI, who had once ruled by divine right, now ruled only with the grudging permission of his own people. But revolution, once begun, rarely stops where its founders intend. By January of 1793, the king was dead. The guillotine fell on the 21st of that month in the Place de la Révolution in Paris, and the crowned heads of Europe looked on in a mixture of horror and cold fury. If a king could be executed by his own subjects, what guarantee existed for any throne? The answer from monarchical Europe was swift and unified. Britain, Austria, Prussia, Spain, the Netherlands, they formed a coalition and declared war on the French Republic. France now stood alone, encircled, fighting for its very survival. And yet, the army meant to defend that republic was in a state of near collapse. Before the revolution, the French officer class had been legally restricted to men of noble birth, a rule formalized in the Ségur Ordinance of 1781. Those aristocratic officers now had a terrible choice to make. Thousands chose emigration, fleeing to join foreign armies or simply to survive. Those who stayed behind faced a new and lethal danger. The radical government in Paris, consumed by paranoia, began purging officers suspected of insufficient revolutionary loyalty. Competence offered no protection. Rank offered no safety. The guillotine was entirely indifferent to military experience. The result was a catastrophic void at the very heart of French military power. An army of hundreds of thousands of men found itself suddenly short of experienced commanders at every level. Someone had to fill that vacuum. Into this chaos stepped a new kind of officer. Men promoted not by birthright but by demonstrated ability, men who had survived precisely because they lacked aristocratic connections. The revolution had destroyed the old hierarchy, and in doing so, it had accidentally created a meritocracy of war. The terror of 1793 and 1794, presided over by Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, consumed thousands of lives and destabilized French institutions to their foundations. Robespierre himself would eventually meet the blade he had so freely wielded. But the Republic endured, battered and ferocious and desperate. France had executed its king, survived invasion, and purged its own military leadership. It now needed something it had not anticipated needing. Commanders of genuine genius, men capable of turning a nation in crisis into a conquering force. In the south of France, a young artillery officer had spent those turbulent years watching, learning, and waiting for the moment when the chaos of revolution would finally call his particular talents forward. The port of Toulon, France's great Mediterranean naval base, fell to its enemies in the summer of 1793 without a single shot fired in its defense. Royalist sympathizers inside the city, deeply hostile to the Paris government, simply opened the harbor gates and invited the British fleet to sail in. Admiral Hood's ships dropped anchor among French warships, French cannon, and French naval stores worth millions of livres. It was a catastrophe, and the Republic screamed for its return. By September, a French Republican army had surrounded the city on its landward sides. The siege, however, was going nowhere. The commanders in charge had no coherent plan. Toulon's natural geography made a frontal assault suicidal. The harbor was protected by two peninsulas, and British guns controlled the high ground with crushing effect. Frustration mounted. Weeks passed. Then a 24-year-old artillery captain named Napoleon Bonaparte rode into camp, introduced by a deputy on mission from Paris, and asked to inspect the siege lines. What he saw, he understood immediately. The other officers had been staring at the city's walls. Bonaparte was looking at the water. He identified a promontory called Liguette, a rocky height on the western peninsula overlooking the inner harbor. Whoever controlled that high ground controlled everything. Place sufficient artillery there, and the British fleet would be unable to remain at anchor. They would face a simple choice: withdraw or be destroyed. Take the guns to the high ground, and Toulon would fall without ever needing to be stormed directly. It was a demonstration of something that would define Napoleon's entire career: his extraordinary ability to read terrain, to see not what a battlefield looked like, but what it meant. While other officers studied maps, he studied consequences. He submitted his plan. It was initially ignored. He submitted it again. Slowly, over weeks of bureaucratic resistance, he accumulated the authority and the resources he needed. He personally oversaw the construction of batteries, dragging heavy guns into position by sheer organizational will, training gun crews through the autumn rains. He gave the key battery a name calculated to appeal to Parisian revolutionary commissioners watching from behind the lines. He called it the Battery of the Men Without Fear. On the night of the 17th of December, 1793, French forces stormed the heights in driving rain and darkness. The fighting was brutal and close. Bonaparte had a horse shot from under him. He took a bayonet wound to the thigh, a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. But the heights fell. Dawn broke over a transformed harbor. British gunners aboard their ships looked up at French artillery looking down. Admiral Hood surveyed the situation for approximately as long as it required to understand it clearly. By the 18th of December, the evacuation had begun. The British fleet withdrew into the Mediterranean, taking with them several thousand Toulon royalists fleeing Republican reprisals. As they left, they attempted to destroy the French naval vessels in the harbor. They succeeded with some. Others survived. Toulon was back in Republican hands. The siege that had dragged through autumn was over in hours once the right plan was finally executed. The rewards came swiftly. On the 22nd of December, 1793, Napoleon Bonaparte was promoted to brigadier general. He was 24 years old. The officer who had arrived at Toulon as a temporarily assigned captain of artillery departed as one of the most discussed young commanders in the Republic. The political commissioners who had watched from the siege lines wrote glowing dispatches to Paris. One of them was a man named Augustin Robespierre, brother of the more famous Maximilian. The connection was noted. The name Bonaparte began circulating in the corridors of revolutionary power. What Toulon revealed to those perceptive enough to notice was something France had desperately needed: a military mind that combined technical mastery with strategic vision, that could hold the mathematics of artillery trajectories in the same thought as the larger geometry of a battle. Europe's armies had not yet grasped what they were dealing with. They would have time to learn. The revolution that had elevated Napoleon also threatened to consume him. On the 27th of July, 1794, the man who had written glowing letters about young Bonaparte fell from power. Maximilian Robespierre, architect of the terror, was arrested on the floor of the National Convention and guillotined the following day. The Thermidorian reaction, as history would call it, swept through Paris like a cold wind. Anyone associated with the Robespierre faction suddenly found themselves under suspicion. Napoleon's connection to Augustin Robespierre was well known. Within 2 weeks of Thermidor, he was placed under house arrest in the south of France. For nearly 2 weeks, he sat in a kind of political purgatory, waiting to learn whether a promising career would end before it had truly begun, or whether it would end at the blade of a guillotine. It ended neither way. Investigation revealed that his relationship with the Robespierres had been professional rather than ideological. He was a soldier, not a Jacobin true believer. He was released in late August, his reputation bruised but his head intact. What followed was a period of frustrating drift. Commands were offered and then withdrawn. A posting to the infantry, which he considered beneath his abilities, was floated and rejected. He lobbied the new government, the Directory, for meaningful assignment. Paris was full of ambitious officers in 1794 and 1795, and the men holding the levers of power had little particular reason to trust a general who had been arrested only months before. Napoleon found himself in the uncomfortable position of being talented, recognized, and ignored. Then, on the 13th of Vendémiaire, in the revolutionary calendar corresponding to the 5th of October, 1795, Paris exploded. Royalist sympathizers, emboldened by the collapse of the Terror and contemptuous of the Directory's fragile authority, massed in the streets. Somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 armed men marched toward the Tuileries, where the convention sat. The Directory's defenders numbered perhaps 5,000. The government was hours from being overrun. A political operative named Paul Barras had been given emergency powers to defend the convention. Barras was many things, but a military tactician was not among them. He needed someone who was. He turned to the available general whose file sat on a desk, a man known for a certain ruthlessness of method and clarity of thought. He sent for Napoleon Bonaparte. What Napoleon grasped immediately, as he had once grasped the geometry of Toulon, was the nature of the problem. Streets favored an armed crowd. Open ground favored artillery. He dispatched a cavalry officer named Joachim Murat to seize the cannons stored at the Sablons camp before the Royalists could reach them. Murat rode through the night and returned with the guns. Bonaparte positioned his artillery at the key approaches to the Tuileries. When the Royalist columns advanced on the afternoon of the 5th of October, they met grape shot fired at close range into densely packed formations. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Within an hour, perhaps as many as 300 lay dead in the Paris streets. The remainder scattered. A popular uprising, the kind that had toppled every government in France for the past 6 years, had been broken not by rhetoric, not by political maneuvering, but by a young general who understood that cannon fired at the right moment ends arguments. The phrase that attached itself to the episode was Napoleon's own, spoken with characteristic precision: a whiff of grape shot. It was rather more than a whiff. But the understatement served him well. The Directory rewarded him within days. He was appointed commander of the Army of the Interior, responsible for the defense of Paris itself. He was 26 years old, and he now controlled the guns of the capital. His attention, however, was already turning south toward the Alps and the campaign that would make his name permanent in history. The army waiting for Napoleon in Nice in the spring of 1796 was, by any honest measure, a disgrace. 40,000 men, at least on paper. In reality, perhaps 37,000 effective soldiers, many of them barefoot, most of them underfed, some units without functional muskets. The Army of Italy had been the revolutionary government's forgotten command, the posting generals accepted when nothing better was offered. Its previous commanders had accomplished nothing of consequence. Its men had learned to forage because the supply system had ceased to function in any meaningful sense. They stole from the local population, brawled among themselves, and survived on something less than military dignity. Napoleon arrived and understood the situation in hours. He did not offer sympathy. He offered something these men had not been given in years: the promise of victory, and with it, plunder. His first address to the army was almost brutally direct. He told them they were poorly fed and poorly clothed. He told them that the fertile plains of northern Italy lay just beyond the mountains ahead. What awaited them there, he suggested, depended entirely on what they were willing to do in the next several weeks. They moved within days. The strategic problem facing Napoleon was elegant in its geometry. Two allied armies, Austrian and Sardinian, held the Alpine passes and the Ligurian hills. Separately, either could be defeated. Together, they controlled enough ground to grind down any frontal assault. The solution, which Napoleon had already worked out in his mind before he ever reached Nice, was to prevent them from acting together. On the 12th of April, 1796, his forces struck at Montagnat, driving a wedge between the Austrian right and the Sardinian left. The blow fell with a speed neither enemy commander had considered possible from troops in such condition. Within 6 days, Napoleon had fought 4 engagements, won all 4, and effectively separated the two armies from each other. The Sardinians, suddenly isolated, faced the prospect of defending their own territory without Austrian support. He turned on them with the full weight of his concentrated force. The Sardinian king, Victor Amadeus III, had no palatable options. Within 2 weeks of Montagnat, he asked for terms. The armistice Napoleon granted on the 28th of April gave France the Alpine fortresses that had guarded the approaches to the Po Valley for a century. A single campaign of less than 3 weeks had neutralized one enemy entirely. Then Napoleon pivoted east toward the Austrians with a momentum his troops could feel in their boots. The crossing of the bridge of Lodi on the 10th of May became something larger than a military engagement. Austrian rearguard artillery had turned the narrow bridge over the Ada River into a killing ground. Napoleon's men charged it anyway, and after savage close-range fighting, took it. The image, slightly embellished with each retelling, planted itself in the European imagination. The young general at the bridge, sword raised, his men surging around him through smoke and fire. Napoleon himself was candid about what Lodi meant to him psychologically. He later wrote that it was there, after Lodi, that he first truly believed he was a superior man, that ambitions he had suppressed as fantasy might actually be within reach. The battle was tactically minor. Its effect on Napoleon's self-conception was not. Milan fell 5 days later. He entered the city on the 15th of May to cheering crowds who had grown exhausted by Austrian rule and knew little yet of what French occupation would actually mean. In 6 weeks, he had done what his predecessors had failed to accomplish in years of desultory campaigning. The method he had demonstrated, though military theorists would spend generations codifying it, was in practice almost simple. Move faster than the enemy expects. Strike at the point where two forces join rather than where either is strongest. Concentrate everything against a divided opponent. Win one engagement, then immediately create the conditions for the next. Speed. Concentration. The exploitation of interior lines. Austria had not yet grasped what was coming for them. The campaign for northern Italy had barely begun. By January of 1797, Austria had thrown 4 armies into Italy. Napoleon had destroyed all 4. The last attempt came at Rivoli on the 14th of January, where Austrian General Alvinzi committed nearly 30,000 men in a coordinated assault from multiple directions. a plan that looked formidable on paper and collapsed entirely in execution. Napoleon read the attack's geometry in real time, pulled forces away from threatened positions, and concentrated them where they could do lethal damage, and within 2 days had shattered the Austrian effort completely. 14,000 Austrian prisoners. The road to Vienna now lay open. What followed was less a military campaign than a procession. Napoleon's army pushed northeast through the Alps, crossing into Austrian territory itself, advancing to within 100 miles of the Habsburg capital before the emperor's government sent emissaries asking for terms. And here is where something extraordinary happened, something that should have alarmed the men who nominally commanded Napoleon back in Paris. He negotiated the peace himself. The Directory, France's 5-man governing committee, had dispatched its own diplomats to handle any settlement with Austria. Napoleon dismissed their involvement with barely concealed contempt. He understood that the moment a civilian bureaucrat took over negotiations, his leverage, built entirely on military pressure, would begin to evaporate. So he met Austrian representatives at Campo Formio in October of 1797 and dictated terms as though he were a head of state rather than a general awaiting orders. The Treaty of Campo Formio was remarkable in its audacity. Austria recognized French control of the Austrian Netherlands and acknowledged French influence over northern Italy. In exchange, Napoleon handed the Austrians the ancient Republic of Venice, a sovereign state France had no legitimate claim to whatsoever. Venice, which had maintained its independence for over 1,000 years, was simply partitioned between two powers that had been fighting each other weeks earlier. The Venetians had not been consulted. They were a bargaining chip, and Napoleon used them without hesitation. Back in northern Italy, he had already been busy reshaping the political landscape. The Cisalpine Republic, formally established in the summer of 1797, merged several territories under a constitution Napoleon himself had largely drafted. He appointed its officials. He organized its army. He corrected its policies. The Cisalpine Republic was, in every practical sense, his creation, and it answered to him. The Directory watched all of this with a mixture of gratitude and genuine alarm. They needed Napoleon's victories. French finances were exhausted. The government's authority in Paris remained fragile, and the general's Italian campaigns had funded the treasury with art, gold, and tribute extracted from conquered territories. They could not afford to lose him. But they could see what he was becoming. A general who negotiated treaties on his own authority. A soldier who built republics and staffed them with loyalists. A public figure whose fame, fed by newspapers and portraits and a carefully managed correspondence, had grown larger than any institution he nominally served. When Napoleon returned to Paris in December of 1797, crowds lined the streets to see him. The directors greeted him with formal ceremony. The atmosphere was polite, celebratory on the surface, and deeply uneasy underneath. Both sides understood that something had shifted. Napoleon was not quite their subordinate anymore, and everyone in the room knew it. The question was what to do with a man the public adored and the army worshipped. A man who had just redrawn the map of Europe with a pen he had picked up without permission. The Directory's answer was to give him another command, somewhere far away, somewhere spectacular enough to satisfy his ambitions without placing him directly at the center of French politics. Their eyes, and soon Napoleon's own, turned toward the Mediterranean, toward Egypt, toward the east. Egypt. The word itself carried a kind of ancient electricity in 1798. For Napoleon, it represented something more than conquest. It represented escape. The Directory wanted him distant. Napoleon wanted something worthy of his ambitions. In Egypt, both desires found their answer. Control the Nile Delta, threaten Britain's overland route to India, and perhaps carve out an Eastern empire that would make Alexander the Great's ghost sit up in recognition. The plan was audacious, logistically terrifying, and deeply romantic. Napoleon loved all three qualities in equal measure. He sailed from Toulon in May of 1798 with nearly 40,000 soldiers and, crucially, something unusual for a military expedition. He brought scientists. 167 scholars, mathematicians, naturalists, and artists accompanied the army, tasked with studying and documenting everything they encountered. Whatever else this campaign would become, Napoleon intended it to be civilized. The army landed in Egypt in late June, endured a brutal march through desert heat that killed men by the dozens, and on the 21st of July reached the Nile Delta within sight of the ancient pyramids of Giza. The Mamluk cavalry that rode out to meet them was spectacular. Thousands of horsemen in brilliant silk robes, armed with pistols and curved swords, mounted on the finest horses in the world. They were also completely unsuited to fight a disciplined European army in tactical formation. Napoleon arranged his men in hollow squares, soldiers facing outward in every direction, bayonets bristling. The Mamluk charges broke against those squares like water against stone. Within 2 hours, Mamluk power in Egypt was shattered. Cairo fell days later. Then came the catastrophe that no amount of tactical brilliance could prevent. On the 1st of August, 1798, Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay near Alexandria. The French admiral had believed the position safe. Nelson attacked anyway, sending ships around both sides of the anchored French line in the gathering darkness. The result was annihilation. 11 of 13 French ships of the line were captured or destroyed. The flagship Orient exploded in a blast heard miles away. In a single night, Napoleon's army became an army without a navy, trapped in Egypt with no clear path home. The expedition's tone changed entirely. Egypt was no longer a launching pad. It was a prison. Yet Napoleon did not stop. His scholars documented ancient temples and deciphered what they could of hieroglyphics, work that would eventually, after a young scholar named Champollion cracked the Rosetta Stone decades later, birth the entire science of Egyptology. In military terms, Napoleon pushed into Syria in the spring of 1799, hoping to reach Constantinople and reshape the entire eastern Mediterranean. At Jaffa, his army committed a massacre of prisoners that still stains the campaign's record. Then, plague arrived. Soldiers in Jaffa began dying of bubonic plague in devastating numbers, and Napoleon visited the stricken men personally, touching the infected to demonstrate courage and calm his terrified troops. Whether it was genuine bravery or calculated theater, no one could say for certain. Perhaps he did not know himself. The Syrian campaign collapsed outside the walls of Acre, where a British naval officer named Sidney Smith helped Ottoman defenders resist every French assault for 2 months. Napoleon turned his army back toward Egypt in defeat. He had conquered Cairo and lost everything that made the conquest matter. By August of 1799, Napoleon had made his decision. Leaving his army behind under a trusted general, he slipped aboard a fast frigate and sailed for France. A coup was brewing in Paris, and Napoleon, as always, intended to be at the center of whatever came next. The frigate slipped through the Mediterranean in extraordinary secrecy. Napoleon had left 40,000 men behind in a dying campaign, and he knew it. The British blockade stretched across those waters like a net, and discovery would have meant capture, humiliation, the end of everything. For 6 weeks, through a combination of luck and careful navigation, the small squadron avoided every British patrol. On the 9th of October, 1799, Napoleon stepped ashore at Fréjus on the southern coast of France. He had gambled everything on that crossing. He had also won. What greeted him was not scandal, but celebration. Word of his arrival raced northward faster than any courier. Crowds gathered at every town along his route to Paris, cheering the general who had won Italy, who had marched to the pyramids, who had dared to challenge the ancient world itself. The disasters, the plague, the stranded army, none of it had reached the French public with any clarity. What they knew was the legend. And the legend was magnificent. While Napoleon had been away, France had suffered badly. The coalition of European powers had seized the opportunity of his absence to roll back French gains. Austrian and Russian armies had driven French forces out of much of Italy and threatened along the Rhine. The brilliant gains of the Italian campaigns, the victories that had made Napoleon famous, were being methodically erased. French soldiers were dying in retreats that felt nothing like the glorious advances of just 2 years before. At home, the Directory had revealed itself as precisely what its critics had always suspected: corrupt, paralyzed, and consumed by factional quarreling, could neither prosecute wars effectively nor address the grinding poverty that still plagued ordinary French citizens. 5 directors governing by committee had produced not stability but stagnation. Tax collectors went unpaid. Soldiers muttered. Parisians who had survived revolution and terror now simply wanted order, competence, someone who could make the machinery of government function without crisis. Into this exhaustion stepped the returning general. The political conspirators already circling the Directory saw in Napoleon exactly what they needed. Emmanuel Joseph C.S., the clever constitutional theorist who had helped architect the revolution a decade earlier, had been planning a coup for months. He needed a sword, a military figure with public credibility to give the takeover legitimacy. He had imagined controlling whatever general he chose. He had not yet met Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon understood the situation immediately. He moved through Paris's salons and political backrooms with the same calculating speed he brought to a battlefield. The myth he carried home from Egypt, burnished by careful omission of its failures, was perhaps the most powerful weapon he had ever possessed. Within weeks, the pieces were in place. On the 18th Brumaire of the year 8 by the revolutionary calendar, the 9th of November, 1799, France would wake up to a different government entirely. The morning of the 9th of November, 1799, began with a deception. The conspirators spread word that a Jacobin terrorist plot had been uncovered, an emergency requiring the legislature to relocate immediately to the Palace of St. Cloud outside Paris. The directors, caught off guard, offered little resistance. 2 were neutralized before breakfast. The machinery of the old government ground to a halt before most of France had finished its morning bread. Napoleon rode through Paris at the head of troops. Crowds watched. Officers saluted. Everything appeared to be proceeding exactly as planned. It was not proceeding as planned. The next day at St. Cloud, when Napoleon entered the chamber of the Council of 500 to address the assembled legislators, something went catastrophically wrong. The man who could silence a battlefield with a single order found himself unable to silence a room. Legislators surged toward him shouting accusations. Voices called him tyrant, outlaw, dictator. Men pressed in from all sides, and Napoleon, the composed commander of armies, faltered. Some accounts suggest he was physically shaken, pale, barely coherent. His words dissolved into stammering. Grenadiers had to pull him from the chamber before the situation became worse. Years of careful myth-building nearly collapsed in that single humiliating afternoon. But Napoleon had something almost as valuable as his own talent. He had his brother Lucien, who was serving at that moment as president of the Council of 500 itself. While Napoleon recovered his composure outside, Lucien stepped forward and did what his famous brother could not. He addressed the grenadiers waiting in the courtyard directly, dramatically, with theatrical genius that would have impressed any revolutionary orator. He pointed toward the chamber and declared that a faction of assassins armed by English gold had terrorized the council. He drew his own sword and swore on his brother's life that he would plunge it into Napoleon's chest himself if Napoleon ever threatened French liberty. Whether the soldiers believed every word hardly mattered. They believed enough. The grenadiers marched into the chamber with fixed bayonets. The Council of 500 scattered through windows and doors into the November gardens. Some fled still wearing their ceremonial togas, scrambling through the hedgerows of St. Cloud in the autumn cold. By evening, a rump of compliant legislators had been gathered from the grounds and persuaded to vote the Directory out of existence. They approved, in its place, a new governing structure called the Consulate, led by 3 consuls, with Napoleon Bonaparte named First Consul of the French Republic. The title was borrowed from ancient Rome, and the borrowing was not accidental. Napoleon understood the power of historical imagery, the way a classical reference could clothe raw ambition in the dignity of tradition. First Consul sounded like the measured authority of the Republic. In practice, it concentrated power in a single pair of hands more completely than any arrangement since the monarchy. 10 years of revolution had produced this moment. 10 years of idealism, terror, war, inflation, and institutional collapse had exhausted France so thoroughly that millions of people were willing, even relieved, to hand authority to one man if that man could simply make things work. The ideals of liberty and popular sovereignty were not abandoned publicly, but they were quietly subordinated to the demand for order. Sieyès and the other architects of the coup believed they had used Napoleon as their instrument. They would spend the following months discovering their mistake. The general who had outmaneuvered Austrian commanders across the plains of northern Italy proved equally capable of outmaneuvering lawyers and theorists in Parisian drawing rooms. France had traded a corrupt committee for something far more consequential. The Republic still existed on paper. A constitution still existed on paper. But at the center of everything now stood a single man of 30 years, with a soldier's instincts, an administrator's hunger for detail, and ambitions that no document had yet been written to contain. The revolution was over. Something else, far larger and stranger, was only beginning. Power, once seized, must be made permanent. Napoleon understood this with the same clarity he brought to artillery trajectories and battlefield geometry. The coup of Brumaire had given him the title. Now he needed the architecture. The Constitution of Year 8 arrived within weeks, drafted at speed and submitted to the French people for ratification in a plebiscite. On paper, it preserved the Republic. There were consuls, tribunals, legislative chambers, the comforting vocabulary of popular government. In practice, the document was a masterpiece of disguised concentration. The 2 junior consuls could speak but not vote on legislation. The first consul alone appointed ministers, generals, ambassadors, and judges. Sieyès, who had spent years designing the perfect Republican constitution, looked at the finished product and recognized too late that he had been completely outmaneuvered. France voted yes by an enormous margin. The exhausted nation wanted order more than it wanted procedural democracy. But ratified power still needed to be defended. Austria had never fully accepted French dominance in Italy, and by the spring of 1800, a new coalition threatened to undo everything Napoleon had won at Campo Formio 3 years earlier. His response was characteristically audacious. He would cross the Alps in May before anyone considered the mountain passes open and fall upon the Austrian rear. The crossing nearly killed the army before the fighting began. The Great St. Bernard Pass defeated horses and artillery with equal indifference. Soldiers dragged cannon barrels through the snow and hollowed out logs. Men slipped from paths above lethal drops. The French emerged into Italy cold, exhausted, and dangerously short of supplies. What followed on the 14th of June 1800 at a small Piedmontese town called Marengo came within hours of catastrophe. Austrian forces caught the French divided and pushed them back across the plain through most of the day. By late afternoon, the battle appeared lost. Then General Desaix, returning from a separate march after hearing the distant cannon, arrived with fresh troops at precisely the decisive moment. The Austrian pursuit collapsed under the unexpected counterattack. Within 2 hours, a French defeat had become a decisive French victory. Desaix himself died in the final charge, never learning what his arrival had rescued. Marengo broke Austrian resistance in Italy. The Peace of Luneville, signed in February 1801, confirmed French dominance over the peninsula and pushed Austrian influence back behind the Rhine. France's eastern frontier was more secure than at any point in a decade. Napoleon now turned to the interior. He understood that military victories meant nothing without institutional foundations. He reorganized France from the ground up. Appointed prefects, loyal administrators answerable directly to Paris, replaced the chaotic tangle of revolutionary local governance in every department of the country. Tax collection, previously farmed out to unreliable private contractors, was systematized and centralized. The Bank of France, founded in 1800, stabilized the currency and provided the state with reliable credit for the first time in a generation. Then came the most delicate negotiation of all. For 10 years, the revolution had treated the Catholic Church as an enemy, confiscating its property, exiling its priests, attempting to replace it with cults of reason and civic virtue. France remained overwhelmingly Catholic in its bones. Napoleon, who was privately indifferent to religion and publicly practical about everything, negotiated directly with Pope Pius VII. The Concordat of 1801 acknowledged Catholicism as the faith of the great majority of French citizens, restored the Church's public role, and ended a decade of bitter rupture between the state and the spiritual life of ordinary people. It was a calculated peace, not a surrender. Napoleon retained state control over church appointments and kept the properties already sold, but millions of French families could once again baptize their children, bury their dead, and hear Mass without political consequence. With his borders secured and his institutions taking shape, Napoleon was already thinking beyond consolidation. The question France would soon confront was whether a republic could contain a man who had remade everything around him. Before Napoleon ever sat at a council table or reviewed a budget, France was governed by chaos, not the dramatic chaos of revolution, but something older and more stubborn. North of the Loire, some 300 distinct sets of customary law governed daily life. South of it, Roman law predominated. Merchant law, ecclesiastical law, royal edicts, provincial traditions, feudal obligations, all of it layered atop one another like geological strata, contradicting and undermining everything around them. A contract valid in Lyon might be worthless in Bordeaux. A marriage recognized in Brittany could be legally invisible in Provence. For ordinary people, justice was not blind. It was simply bewildering. The revolution had promised to end this. It had not. A decade of constitutional experiments had produced ringing declarations but no functioning legal code. The lawyers kept debating while France kept suffering under inherited confusion. Napoleon ended the debate personally. Beginning in earnest after 1801, he convened expert committees of distinguished jurists, men like Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambaceres, who had already attempted 3 failed drafts under previous governments. Napoleon attended over 30 of the drafting sessions himself, not as a ceremonial presence, but as an active participant. He asked sharp questions. He challenged legal abstractions when they conflicted with practical governance. He pushed and prodded, and witnesses recorded, sometimes dominated the room for hours with his own arguments. The result, promulgated in March 1804, was the Civil Code. Later renamed the Napoleonic Code, it ran to over 2,000 articles and did something that centuries of French kings had never managed. It unified the law of France into a single coherent system accessible to any literate person. Its core principles were radical in their simplicity. All male citizens stood equal before the law regardless of birth or title. Property rights were protected with absolute clarity. Feudalism, which the Revolution had theoretically abolished but never legally dismantled, was now gone in statute as surely as it was gone in practice. Contracts were enforceable and standardized. Courts operated on secular authority, not ecclesiastical tradition. A man's legal standing no longer depended on which province he had been born in or which church he attended. But the code had its limits, and those limits revealed something important about Napoleon's vision of order. Women, who had briefly glimpsed expanded rights during the revolutionary years, found themselves legally subordinated to their husbands. A married woman could not sign contracts, own property independently, or pursue legal action without her husband's consent. Workers lost the right to organize collectively. The code protected individual property with fierce clarity while offering the poor and the laboring classes almost nothing to protect them against the powerful. Napoleon never pretended otherwise. He believed hierarchy was natural and order was primary. Equality before the law meant equality between propertied men. Everything else was secondary. Yet, even with its contradictions, the code's reach became extraordinary. As French armies swept across Europe, the code followed. It was adopted in the Netherlands, in much of Italy, in the German states along the Rhine, in Spain, in Poland. When Louisiana was sold to the United States in 1803, its legal traditions remained rooted in French civil law, a fact that still distinguishes Louisiana courts from every other American state today. Quebec, Belgium, and Louisiana all carry traces of Napoleon's council table in their legal systems. Military victories fade. Empires collapse. But a legal framework, once embedded in a society's institutions, proves remarkably durable. Napoleon himself would later say from exile that his greatest achievement was not Austerlitz or Marengo, but the code. He was not wrong. And he was only getting started. He was not wrong. But a man who had unified France's laws, made peace with the church, and survived assassination plots was beginning to ask a larger question. Was First Consul sufficient? Could a republic, even a manipulated one, truly hold an empire together? The answer came wrapped in blood. In March 1804, French agents crossed into the German state of Baden and seized the Duc d'Enghien, a Bourbon prince living quietly in exile. He had no proven connection to any conspiracy against Napoleon. He was guilty essentially of existing, of bearing the wrong name. Napoleon had him tried by a military tribunal in the dead of night and shot before dawn at the fortress of Vincennes. The message was unmistakable. The Bourbons would not return. No one would restore the old dynasty while Napoleon breathed. The execution horrified European courts. Talleyrand, Napoleon's own foreign minister, called it worse than a crime. He called it a mistake, but internally, it achieved its purpose. Opposition fell silent. The old royalist networks understood that their patron saint was gone, and that the man in Paris played by different rules entirely. Within weeks, the Senate proposed the logical conclusion. France needed permanence. Permanence required heredity. Heredity required an emperor. The plebiscite that followed in the summer of 1804 recorded over 3.5 million votes in favor, with barely 2,000 opposed. Historians have spent generations examining those numbers with considerable skepticism. Local officials understood what results were expected. Abstentions were sometimes counted as approval. The machinery of consent was well-oiled and thoroughly managed, but some genuine enthusiasm was real. After a decade of revolution, terror, and instability, the promise of order under a strong hand carried genuine appeal for millions of exhausted French citizens. On the 2nd of December 1804, Notre Dame Cathedral was transformed. 12,000 candles burned inside the great medieval nave. The walls were draped in velvet and imperial regalia. Pope Pius VII had traveled all the way from Rome, an extraordinary concession, a pope attending the coronation of a self-made emperor from Corsica. And then came the moment that made every monarchist in Europe catch their breath. As the ceremony reached its climax, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's outstretched hands and placed it on his own head. He crowned himself. Then he crowned Josephine. The message was clear and deliberate. He owed his throne to no one. Not to the church, not to God's intermediaries, not to tradition or blood. He had made himself, and he was making France. The new emperor wasted no time constructing the architecture of permanence. A new imperial nobility emerged, built not on ancient bloodlines but on service and merit, at least in theory. Marshals, ministers, and generals received titles and estates. It was the old hierarchy dressed in new clothes, and Napoleon understood the contradiction perfectly. He simply did not care. Order required structure. Structure required rank. Far to the north, in Vienna, a 33-year-old composer named Ludwig van Beethoven had been working on a symphony he privately dedicated to Napoleon, the great liberator, the heir of revolutionary ideals. When news arrived that the first consul had crowned himself emperor, Beethoven erupted in fury. He seized the title page of his Third Symphony and tore out the dedication so violently that he left a hole in the paper. The symphony survived. The dedication did not. He renamed it simply the Eroica, the heroic. Even in a composer's enraged gesture, the question that would define the next decade was already forming. Was Napoleon the revolution's fulfillment or its betrayal? The crowned emperor was about to answer with cannon fire. He had an army that could conquer continents, and he could not get it across 20 miles of water. By the summer of 1805, Napoleon had assembled at Boulogne on the northern French coast the most formidable land force Europe had ever seen. 160,000 soldiers, the Grande Armée, drilled daily in sight of the English cliffs. They had been waiting nearly 2 years. They had grown lean and disciplined and ferocious with readiness. Napoleon himself inspected their camps repeatedly, watching columns of men practice the rapid maneuvers that would make them legendary. The army existed for one purpose: to cross the Channel, march on London, and end the war with Britain once and forever. The problem was the Royal Navy. Britain's fleet ruled the waters between Boulogne and Dover with a completeness that no French admiral could overcome. Napoleon's solution was elegant in theory and catastrophic in practice. He ordered Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve to draw the British fleet westward into the Atlantic, loop south to the Caribbean, return, and then seize temporary control of the Channel for just long enough to escort the invasion barges across. 3 days of naval superiority was all Napoleon asked. 3 days, and Britain was finished. Villeneuve tried. He led the combined Franco-Spanish fleet on a months-long chase across the Atlantic and back, but wherever he maneuvered, the British followed, alert and relentless. By August, having achieved nothing, Villeneuve retreated to the Spanish port of Cadiz. Napoleon raged. His window was closing. That same month, alarming news arrived from the east. Austria and Russia were mobilizing against him. The invasion camp had to be abandoned. The Grande Armée turned away from the sea and began its famous march toward the Danube. The dream of invading Britain was effectively finished, though no one had formally declared it so. Napoleon ordered Villeneuve to sea one final time, hoping at least for a Mediterranean distraction. Villeneuve obeyed, sailing from Cadiz on the 19th of October, 1805, with 33 ships of the line. He knew it might be a death sentence. Waiting for him off Cape Trafalgar on the southwestern tip of Spain was Admiral Horatio Nelson, commanding 27 British ships. Nelson attacked on the 21st of October in a manner that orthodox naval theory considered almost reckless. Rather than sailing parallel to the enemy line and exchanging broadsides, he drove his fleet directly into the Franco-Spanish formation in two perpendicular columns. The approach meant his lead ships absorbed devastating fire before they could effectively return it. But Nelson had calculated exactly what would happen when his columns broke through the enemy line. It would shatter into isolated groups, each surrounded, each unable to support the others. The battle lasted less than 5 hours. By its end, 19 enemy ships had been captured or destroyed. Not a single British vessel was lost. The combined Franco-Spanish fleet was annihilated as a fighting force, never to be reconstituted. But Nelson did not live to see the final accounting. Stationed on the deck of his flagship, the Victory, conspicuous in his admiral's coat covered in medals, he was struck by a musket ball fired from a French sharpshooter in the rigging above. The ball passed through his shoulder, pierced his lung, and lodged in his spine. He was carried below decks, where he died 3 hours later, knowing the battle was won. His last words, recorded by those around him, were simply that he had done his duty. The consequences of Trafalgar were permanent and profound. Britain would remain beyond Napoleon's reach for the rest of his reign. The Channel, that narrow strip of gray water, became an absolute boundary, separating the world's greatest land empire from the world's greatest sea power. British commerce would continue funding coalitions against France. British soldiers would eventually land on the continent's edges. Napoleon had turned east out of necessity, and east was where both his greatest glories and his ultimate ruin waited. He had turned away from the sea, and within weeks, he would make the world forget he had ever looked at it. The Grande Armée covered ground at a pace that stunned its enemies. In just 23 days, nearly 200,000 French soldiers marched from the Channel coast to the banks of the Danube, an advance of nearly 600 miles. Staff officers calculated rations and routes with mechanical precision. Corps commanders like Davout, Soult, and Ney pushed their men hard but fed them harder. This was an army that moved faster than its opponents could think. The results were immediate. In mid-October of 1805, Napoleon enveloped an entire Austrian army of 70,000 men at Ulm, capturing it almost without a pitched battle. It was strategy as pure humiliation. The Austrian commander surrendered with barely a shot fired. The road to Vienna lay open. The French entered the Austrian capital on the 13th of November. Napoleon rode through a city that had fallen not to siege or slaughter, but simply to the logic of momentum. Vienna's capture was significant, but Napoleon understood something his enemies had not yet grasped. Capitals were symbols. Armies were the real prize. The Russian and Austrian forces, commanded by General Mikhail Kutuzov and the young Tsar Alexander I, retreated northeast toward Moravia. Napoleon followed, and then he did something counterintuitive. He stopped. He pulled his forces back. He allowed his right flank to appear dangerously exposed and weakly held. His camps projected exhaustion and hesitation. It was entirely theater. The Allied commanders saw what Napoleon wanted them to see: a French army stretched thin, vulnerable on its southern flank, an emperor perhaps overextended and afraid. The temptation to sweep around that exposed right wing and cut Napoleon off from Vienna proved irresistible. On the morning of the 2nd of December, 1805, the combined Allied army began shifting its best troops southward to execute that flanking maneuver. They had just handed Napoleon the battle he wanted. The moment the Allied center weakened, French Marshal Soult's corps erupted from the mists of an early winter dawn and stormed straight up the Pratzen Heights, the commanding ground at the battle's heart. The Allied center did not bend. It collapsed. Within 90 minutes, the high ground belonged to France, and the Allied army had been split in two. What followed was destruction. The southern Allied wing, rushing toward the flanking objective, found itself trapped against frozen ponds. French artillery turned on the ice. Soldiers plunged through. The northern wing was crushed and scattered across the Moravian plain. By afternoon, the coalition army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The combined Russian and Austrian casualties numbered nearly 36,000 men. The French lost fewer than 9,000. Napoleon called it the finest battle he ever fought, and history has not seriously disputed him. Austerlitz became the standard against which all subsequent military operations were measured. It was the sun around which his legend orbited. The diplomatic consequences came swiftly. Austria signed the Treaty of Pressburg on the 26th of December, surrendering significant territories and paying an indemnity of 40 million francs. More dramatically, the treaty accelerated the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, that ancient, creaking structure stretching back over 1,000 years to Charlemagne. In August of 1806, the last Holy Roman Emperor, Francis II, formally dissolved it. An institution older than memory had ended because one man had maneuvered another army onto the wrong ground on a cold morning in Moravia. But destroying coalitions and dismantling empires raised its own dangers. Every treaty signed in humiliation planted seeds of future resistance, and Napoleon was about to discover how different an enemy Prussia could be. Prussia had watched Austerlitz from the sidelines, calculating, hesitating, negotiating. That hesitation cost them everything. In October of 1806, Prussia finally moved against France, confident its legendary army, the legacy of Frederick the Great, remained the finest fighting force in Europe. It had not fought a major war in over a decade. That, as it turned out, was precisely the problem. On the 14th of October, Napoleon struck with two simultaneous hammer blows. At Jena, he personally led the assault against the Prussian main force, shattering it within hours. 40 miles north, Marshal Davout, commanding just 26,000 men, met the bulk of the Prussian army under the Duke of Brunswick at Auerstedt. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, Davout attacked anyway and won. Brunswick died on the field. The Prussian army did not merely lose that day. It dissolved. Within weeks, fortress after fortress surrendered without serious resistance. Napoleon entered Berlin on the 27th of October. The state that Frederick the Great had built across a lifetime fell in less than 3 weeks. Yet destroying Prussia opened a vast, cold frontier beyond it. Russia was coming. The winter campaign that followed was unlike anything the Grande Armée had yet endured. On the 8th of February, 1807, French and Russian forces collided at Eylau in a blinding snowstorm. The battle was carnage without conclusion. A French corps marched directly into the Russian center and was nearly annihilated. Napoleon ordered his cavalry reserve, 10,000 horsemen under Murat, to charge across the frozen ground simply to buy time. They did, cutting through the Russian lines and back again in one of history's most spectacular and desperate cavalry actions. When night fell, both sides held their ground. Both sides had suffered catastrophically. For the first time in years, Napoleon could claim no clear victory. Eylau shook the myth of French invincibility. But myths, Napoleon understood, required maintenance. He found his answer that June. At Friedland, on the 14th, he caught the Russian army crowded against a river bend with limited escape routes and unleashed Marshal Ney's corps against their exposed left flank. The Russians lost perhaps 25,000 men. The road to the Tsar's heartland lay open. Alexander chose negotiation. The two emperors met on a raft anchored in the middle of the Niemen River at Tilsit, a scene of extraordinary theatrical symbolism. Two men, two empires, dividing a world between them. Russia accepted French dominance in Western Europe. France accepted Russian interests in the East. Prussia was reduced to half its former size and stripped of its dignity. A new French satellite state, the Kingdom of Westphalia, was carved from Prussian territory and handed to Napoleon's youngest brother Jerome. The Bonaparte family, in fact, now occupied thrones across the continent. Joseph ruled Naples. Louis governed Holland. Joachim Murat would soon reign over kingdoms of his own. Napoleon had created a dynasty from nothing, placing relatives on thrones like pieces on a chessboard. To strangle Britain economically, Napoleon announced the Continental System, a sweeping embargo forbidding European ports from trading with the British. The logic was sound. The execution was another matter. Smuggling flourished. Neutral nations resented the pressure. The very allies he needed found the restrictions unbearable. Napoleon stood at the absolute apex of his power. From the Pyrenees to the borders of Russia, Europe answered to Paris. But a system built on continuous victory carried within it a dangerous assumption that the victories would never stop coming. One peninsula to the southwest was about to test that assumption in ways that no amount of battlefield genius could easily answer. Spain had seemed, at first glance, like an opportunity. The Bourbon monarchy ruling from Madrid was weak, faction-ridden, and deeply unpopular with its own people. When a dispute between the Spanish king Charles IV and his son Ferdinand erupted into open crisis in early 1808, Napoleon saw a vacancy waiting to be filled. He summoned both men to Bayonne, coaxed and bullied them into surrendering their claims, and placed his elder brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. It was the same formula that had worked in Naples, in Holland, in Westphalia. Spain, Napoleon believed, would follow the pattern. He had never been more wrong. On the 2nd of May, 1808, Madrid rose. What began as a confrontation around the royal palace spread through the city's narrow streets into something savage and uncontrollable. French cavalry, Egyptian Mamelukes included, cut down civilians with sabers. The citizens of Madrid answered with kitchen knives, scissors, anything at hand. The Spanish painter Francisco Goya was living in the city that day. He would later translate what he witnessed onto canvas with a ferocity that still silences rooms. His image of French soldiers executing bound men in the darkness, the prisoners' arms thrown wide, one white shirt burning almost luminous against the night, became the defining testament to what happened when Napoleon's empire met a people who refused to accept it. The reprisals that followed the Dos de Mayo only deepened Spanish fury. Rather than extinguishing resistance, they distributed it. Every village became a potential fortress. Every mountain pass concealed enemies. The Spanish word for this kind of fighting entered every European language that year. Guerrilla. Little war. Fought not by armies in formation, but by bands of irregulars who ambushed supply columns, assassinated collaborators, and vanished into terrain that French commanders found bewildering. The Grande Armée had been designed to destroy other armies. It had no effective answer for an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. Then came the shock that reverberated across the entire continent. In late July, at Bayonet in southern Spain, a French army corps of nearly 18,000 men under General Dupont found itself surrounded by Spanish regular forces. What happened next was without precedent. Dupont surrendered. An entire French army, in open battle, had capitulated. The news landed on European capitals like a thunderclap. If the French could be beaten in the field if surrender was possible, then the legend Napoleon had spent a decade constructing had a crack running through it. Napoleon came to Spain himself that autumn, bringing veteran troops, reimposing order with brutal efficiency, and driving the British forces that had landed in Portugal back toward the coast. It looked briefly like the familiar pattern reasserting itself. But he could not stay. Events in Central Europe demanded his attention, and the moment he left, the fire reignited. Into this slow catastrophe stepped a British general named Arthur Wellesley. Methodical where French commanders were impetuous, patient where they were aggressive, Wellesley understood that Portugal's mountainous terrain and Spain's ferocious population gave him advantages no pitched battle could provide. He would not need to outfight Napoleon's marshals. He would simply outlast them. Napoleon himself later called Spain his ulcer. The metaphor was precise. It did not kill quickly. It drained and exhausted and consumed year after year, swallowing men and money and horses that were needed desperately elsewhere. 6 years of fighting in the peninsula would cost France perhaps 300,000 soldiers. And while France bled in the west, the wound Napoleon had tried to close at Tilsit was quietly reopening in the east. By the summer of 1810, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the summit of everything he had built. The numbers alone were staggering. The French Empire had swelled to 130 departments, stretching from the Dutch coastline to the Illyrian shores of the Adriatic. Beyond those direct borders, satellite kingdoms answered to brothers and marshals bearing titles freshly invented. Beyond those, allied states from Denmark to the Confederation of the Rhine bent to Paris like flowers toward the sun. No European power had dominated the continent so completely since the legions of ancient Rome. Austria had tried again to change this. In the spring of 1809, Vienna launched its fifth attempt to break Napoleon's grip, fielding the most capable army the Habsburgs had assembled in years. Napoleon met them at Wagram in early July, 2 grinding days of artillery and mass assault that left the battlefield carpeted with nearly 70,000 casualties on both sides. Austria signed away yet more territory and accepted yet another humiliating peace. The message was unmistakable. The empire was unchallengeable in the open field. Yet, even in triumph, Napoleon was thinking about time. He had no legitimate heir. Josephine, the Creole widow from Martinique who had been at his side through the years of his ascent, had never given him a child. In December of 1809, in a scene witnesses described as quietly devastating, Napoleon told her the marriage must end. She wept. He wept. Neither doubted the political necessity. The divorce was formalized within weeks. What followed was a calculated act of dynasty building. Napoleon married Marie-Louise of Austria, daughter of the Habsburg emperor he had just defeated. The symbolism was deliberate and breathtaking. The artillery officer from Corsica was now son-in-law to the oldest royal house in Europe. On the 20th of March, 1811, Marie-Louise delivered a son. The infant was proclaimed King of Rome at birth, his title advertising his father's imperial ambitions to anyone who still missed them. The empire looked impregnable. It was not. The continental system, Napoleon's grand strategy of choking Britain through economic blockade, was quietly strangling the continent's own merchants and farmers. Bread prices rose. Trade withered. In the satellite kingdoms, populations that had initially welcomed French law and French efficiency were discovering that French taxation and French conscription accompanied them. Nationalism, that force Napoleon had harnessed so brilliantly in France, was beginning to stir in the very peoples he now ruled. In the Prussian academies, philosophers were writing about German identity with a new and urgent passion. In the churches of Spain and Poland and Italy, priests preached resistance. The administrative genius that had unified France was generating, elsewhere, a slow and gathering resentment. The empire at its zenith cast long shadows. And in the east, where Alexander of Russia was quietly withdrawing from the continental system and massing cavalry on his western frontier, those shadows were about to grow very dark indeed. The breaking point came over commerce and pride. Tsar Alexander, watching Russian merchants suffer under the continental system's restrictions, had quietly reopened his ports to neutral shipping carrying British goods. Napoleon saw it as betrayal. Alexander saw it as survival. The Tilsit alliance, the grand friendship forged on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River just 5 years earlier, dissolved into mutual accusation and cold fury. By the spring of 1812, both men knew what was coming. What Napoleon assembled on the banks of the Niemen that June was unlike anything Europe had ever witnessed. 600,000 soldiers drawn from across the continent, Frenchmen alongside Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutch, Portuguese, Austrians, and Prussians, all marching under the eagles. They called it the Grande Armée, and the name felt entirely appropriate. It was less an army than a moving nation, stretching for miles along every road, consuming everything in its path before a single battle had been fought. On the 24th of June, 1812, they crossed into Russia. And then they marched. And marched. And found nothing. The Russian commanders, Barclay de Tolly and later the old fox Kutuzov, had made a brutal calculation. Russia's greatest weapon was not its army. It was its size. Every time Napoleon sought the decisive engagement that had broken every other enemy, the Russians simply withdrew. They burned their own crops, their own villages, their own supply depots. They left Napoleon's vast host nothing to eat and no one to defeat. The summer heat was savage. The roads turned to dust, then mud. Horses died by the thousands. Men followed. Napoleon had expected a short, sharp campaign. What he was getting instead was a slow bleeding. Then, at last, a battle. Outside the village of Borodino on the 7th of September, Kutuzov turned and fought. What followed was 7 hours of industrialized slaughter on a scale that even veteran soldiers found almost impossible to absorb. Over 70,000 casualties between both sides in a single day, corpses packed so densely in certain redoubts that soldiers could barely advance without stepping on the fallen. Napoleon committed his reserves piecemeal, hesitating at the crucial moments, unable or unwilling to deliver the annihilating blow his tactics had always promised. When the guns finally fell silent, both armies still stood. The road to Moscow was open, but Russia's army had not been destroyed. Kutuzov simply retreated again. On the 14th of September, Napoleon rode into Moscow, expecting the symbolic surrender that had always followed such moments. The keys to the city, the bowing officials, the negotiated peace. Instead, he found silence. The population had fled. And in the night, fires began. Whether by deliberate order or the actions of Russian patriots, Moscow burned for 5 days. The wooden city became a furnace. Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as the metropolis he had conquered dissolved into ash and smoke. He waited weeks for Alexander to send peace terms that never came. The Tsar had resolved to give him nothing, not a city, not a treaty, not even the dignity of a response. Napoleon sat in the ruins of Moscow as September turned to October, and October began its turn toward November. The Russian winter, that oldest and most patient of enemies, was gathering itself just beyond the horizon. He had taken the greatest city in Russia. He had won nothing at all. The retreat that followed would not merely end a campaign. It would end an era. The order to retreat came on the 19th of October, 1812. Napoleon had waited 5 weeks in the charred skeleton of Moscow, long enough for hope to curdle into something closer to desperation. Alexander would not negotiate. Winter would not wait. The Grande Armée, already reduced by disease and starvation and the long march east, turned its back on the smoldering ruins and began the long road home. It began almost like an orderly withdrawal. Nearly 100,000 soldiers still under arms, accompanied by a vast tail of camp followers, wounded men, looted treasures, and thousands of wagons. Napoleon initially attempted a southern route toward fresher territory, but Kutuzov's army blocked the way at Maloyaroslavets after a savage engagement in late October. Grudgingly, Napoleon turned back north, back onto the same road they had come in on, the same road the Grande Armée had stripped bare of every resource on its way east. There was nothing left to eat. There was nothing left to burn. And then the cold arrived. Within days of the turn north, temperatures plunged far below freezing. Men who had survived Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, and Borodino now died quietly in the snow, sitting upright against trees, frozen in the act of resting. Frostbite took fingers, then hands, then feet. Soldiers burned their coats for minutes of warmth, then marched on in rags. The horses, already dying from exhaustion and lack of fodder, lost their footing on the ice-glazed roads and could not rise. Artillery pieces, those symbols of everything Napoleon had built his genius upon, were abandoned by the hundreds. The Cossacks who shadowed the column's flanks picked off stragglers with merciless efficiency, appearing from the tree line, striking, vanishing again before any defense could form. What had been an army became a procession of ghosts. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November was the campaign's final horror. Russian forces closed in from multiple directions, intending to trap and annihilate what remained. Napoleon's engineers, working in freezing water for hours at a stretch, managed to throw 2 makeshift bridges across the river in a feat of extraordinary courage and suffering. For 2 days, the remnants of the Grande Armée stumbled across while French rearguard troops held the Russian forces at bay. Then panic set in. Men fought each other for space on the bridges. Wagons overturned. The wounded who could not walk were simply left behind on the eastern bank. When the bridges were finally burned to stop the Russian advance, thousands were still waiting to cross. The river, choked with bodies, ran red into the ice. Perhaps 50,000 soldiers crossed the Berezina in any condition to fight. Behind them lay the evidence of the worst military catastrophe in modern history. Napoleon himself did not see the end. On the 5th of December at Smorgoni, he summoned his marshals and announced he was leaving. France needed him, he told them. The political situation in Paris demanded his presence. The army was placed under the command of Murat. 3 days later, traveling by sly under a false name, Napoleon crossed back into Poland. He was in Paris by the 18th of December, less than a fortnight after abandoning the men who had followed him to the edge of the known world. Of the 600,000 who had crossed the Niemen that bright June morning, fewer than 100,000 returned. Entire nations had contributed regiments that simply ceased to exist. The losses to cold, starvation, combat, and disease were so vast that contemporaries struggled to comprehend them. Europe had never seen destruction on this scale inflicted on a single military force, and not by an enemy army alone, but by distance, hunger, and weather. Napoleon had come to Russia to punish a czar. He had destroyed himself instead. Word of the catastrophe spread faster than the survivors. In the courts and capitals of Europe, men who had spent years in terrified submission to French power began, very quietly, to reconsider. The emperor was not invincible after all. The wolves were beginning to circle. The wolves did not wait long. By the spring of 1813, Prussia had broken from its forced alliance with France and joined Russia in open war. Sweden followed, led by one of Napoleon's own former marshals, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, now crown prince and eager to prove his new loyalties. The Sixth Coalition was taking shape, and for the first time, it carried something the previous coalitions had lacked: genuine unity of purpose. Europe had seen what Russia had done. It wanted the same. Napoleon, characteristically, refused to accept the arithmetic. Within months of returning to Paris, he had conjured a new army from conscripts, veterans recalled from Spain, and whatever remained of the old guard. It was younger, greener, and desperately short of cavalry. Those horses lost in the Russian snow could not be replaced so quickly. But it was an army, and in the spring he led it east again. At Lutzen in May, and then at Bautzen 3 weeks later, he won. Not the crushing, decisive victories of earlier years, but wins nonetheless, enough to push the Allied forces back and remind Europe that the old genius had not entirely left him. A stunned coalition agreed to an armistice in June. It was the worst decision they could have made. Napoleon used the pause to rest and refit. The Allies used it to bring Austria into the war. That was the trap closing. Austria's defection in August 1813 changed everything. Suddenly, Napoleon faced coordinated armies numbering over 300,000 men approaching from multiple directions at once. He moved brilliantly, shifting his forces to meet each thrust, defeating the Allies at Dresden in late August in what would prove to be his last great battlefield victory. But his subordinates were losing the battles he was not present for, and the noose was drawing tighter with every week. By October, the Allied armies had converged on Leipzig, a Saxon city of modest size that was about to become the stage for something the world had never witnessed. Over 4 days, from the 16th to the 19th of October, roughly 500,000 soldiers fought in and around that city. French, Germans, Poles, Spaniards, Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Swedes, all locked together in a grinding, catastrophic collision. Cannon fire turned the surrounding villages to rubble. The streets of Leipzig ran with blood. Saxon troops, midway through the battle, changed sides entirely and turned their guns on their former comrades. Even then, Napoleon held his lines. But holding was not enough. He was outnumbered nearly 2-1, and the Allied forces simply would not break. On the 19th, with retreat the only option remaining, a French corporal accidentally blew the main bridge too early, stranding tens of thousands of soldiers inside the city. The rear guard was annihilated. Thousands drowned attempting to swim the river. Napoleon crossed the Rhine in November with fewer than 80,000 effectives. Behind him, the satellite kingdoms built over a decade simply collapsed, one after another, like walls with no foundation left to stand on. France itself was next, and Napoleon knew it. In January 1814, the Allied armies crossed the French frontier in force. Coalition commanders moved with a confidence they had never before possessed on French soil, nearly 300,000 men pushing westward in converging columns toward Paris. The empire that had once stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean had shrunk to its original borders, and now even those were under threat. What followed was perhaps the most astonishing display of Napoleon's military genius. Outnumbered sometimes 4 or 5 to 1, commanding a patchwork force of exhausted veterans and barely trained young conscripts, he fought what historians would later call the 6 Days Campaign. In just 6 days of February, he struck the Prussian forces under Blucher 6 separate times, winning each engagement in turn. He was everywhere at once, reading ground, shifting troops, arriving where the enemy least expected him. Those who watched him in those weeks said it was like watching 1805 again, the same blazing speed, the same instinct for the enemy's weakness. But speed and genius could not conjure men from nothing. For every Allied division he bloodied, 2 more appeared to take its place. By late March, the coalition strategy became brutally simple. Stop chasing Napoleon. Go around him and take Paris directly. On the 30th of March, Allied forces fought their way through the northern heights of Montmartre and stood above the capital. The city surrendered the following morning. Napoleon was miles away when he learned what had happened. He rode hard through the night, arriving at the post house of Juvisy to find the road to his capital blocked by his own retreating cavalry. Paris was gone. He fell back to the palace of Fontainebleau, and there the final act played out. His marshals, bone-weary men who had followed him across a continent for 20 years, gathered around him and delivered their verdict. They would not march on Paris. They would not fight another campaign. Nay, the bravest of the brave spoke for them all. The army would not follow the emperor against France itself. On the 6th of April 1814, Napoleon signed the Act of Abdication. That night, alone in his study, he swallowed a vial of poison he had carried since the Russian retreat, a mixture of opium and belladonna prepared for exactly this moment. It had lost its potency. He survived, racked with convulsions through the night. To face the morning, he had tried to escape. The Treaty of Fontainebleau granted him sovereignty over the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, a kingdom of 12,000 souls and roughly 86 square miles. He was permitted an honor guard of 1,000 men and an annual pension from France. Louis XVIII, brother of the king guillotined in 1793, was restored to the throne in Paris. A dynasty built in blood and thunder was replaced, almost quietly, with the dynasty it had overthrown. But the man at the center of it all was not finished. Elba was very close to the French coast, and Napoleon had always been good at watching and waiting. He had been watching for months. From his small palace on Elba, Napoleon maintained what amounted to an intelligence operation. Visitors arrived regularly, merchants and diplomats and sympathizers, and each brought news from the mainland. What they told him was encouraging. The Bourbon Restoration was going badly. Returned émigrés were reclaiming old estates and talking openly about reversing the revolutionary land settlements that millions of French families depended on. Veterans who had crossed the Niemen and climbed the passes of the Sierra Nevada found themselves pensionless, their campaigns dismissed, their emperor mocked in royalist pamphlets. Across France, the question was the same everywhere. Was this what they had bled for? Napoleon listened, calculated, and made his decision. On the 1st of March, 1815, he stepped ashore at the Gulf Juan, a small bay near Antibes in southern France. He had with him roughly 1,000 men, some artillery, and a conviction that France would come back to him. It was, by any rational measure, a desperate gamble. 1,000 soldiers against the armies of a kingdom. His enemies, when they heard the news, said he had gone mad. They had not been to Laffrey. Moving north through the Alpine foothills, Napoleon's tiny column approached the village of Laffrey on the 7th of March. Ahead of them on the road stood a battalion of royal troops, muskets loaded, orders to halt the advance. The two forces faced each other across a narrow pass. Here, surely, was the end of this extraordinary adventure. Napoleon rode forward alone. He dismounted, walked toward the leveled muskets, opened his coat, and spoke. "Soldiers, if there is one among you who wishes to shoot his emperor, here I am." The silence stretched. Then one man lowered his weapon. Then another. Then the entire battalion broke ranks and surged forward, shouting his name, tearing the white Bourbon cockades from their hats and replacing them with the tricolor. It happened again and again as he moved north. Regiment after regiment sent to intercept him dissolved into his growing column instead. Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XVIII to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, rode out to meet him at Auxerre, looked at the man he had followed across a continent, and crossed over with his entire force. Louis XVIII did not wait for Napoleon to arrive in Paris. He left quietly in the night of the 19th of March, heading for the Belgian border. The following evening, Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace carried on the shoulders of a crowd. The journey from the beach at Gulf Juan to the capital had taken 20 days. In Vienna, the great powers of Europe received the news and responded with startling speed. Within days, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia had formed the Seventh Coalition and pledged their combined armies to ending Napoleon's return. He had his empire back. Now, he had to defend it against the entire world. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Wellington commanded roughly 68,000 men in Belgium. Blücher led 90,000 Prussians nearby. Together, they outnumbered Napoleon's army of the north by nearly 2-1. If the Austrian and Russian forces to the east were allowed to mobilize and march, the numbers became impossible. Napoleon had perhaps 6 weeks before the coalition closed around him like a fist. His only chance was to strike first, drive between the Allied armies, and destroy each one before they could combine. On the 16th of June, he nearly pulled it off. At Ligny, Napoleon personally led the assault that shattered Blücher's Prussian army, wounding the old field marshal himself when his horse rolled over him during the retreat. It was a genuine victory. But the pursuit was handed to Marshal Grouchy, a capable cavalry commander given a task that required something rarer: initiative. Grouchy followed the Prussians cautiously, never pressing hard enough to prevent them from regrouping. When he heard the guns of Waterloo 2 days later and an aide urged him to march toward the sound of the fighting, he refused. His orders said to follow the Prussians. He would follow the Prussians. That decision, made in a farmhouse over a quiet breakfast, helped end an empire. 2 miles south of the village of Waterloo, Wellington chose his ground carefully, positioning his army along a ridge behind the Brussels road. The morning of June the 18th, 1815 was wet. The fields churned to mud from overnight rain. Napoleon delayed his attack until nearly noon, waiting for the ground to firm. That delay, perhaps 3 hours, would cost him everything. The battle opened with an assault on the farmhouse of Hougoumont, a fortified chateau on Wellington's right flank. What began as a diversionary attack drew in thousands of French troops across the entire day. A handful of British guardsmen who managed to slam the chateau's north gate closed held it against everything Napoleon threw at them. Hougoumont never fell. Through the afternoon, the French infantry hammered Wellington's lines again and again. The central strongpoint at La Haye-Sainte finally fell in the early evening, and for a moment the Allied center looked genuinely vulnerable. Then Marshal Ney, commanding the French cavalry, launched one of history's most spectacular and futile charges. Thousands of cuirassiers and lancers swept up the ridge in waves, only to find Wellington's infantry waiting in squares. The defensive formation cavalry could not break. The horses would not charge into a wall of bayonets. The squares held. It was nearly 7 in the evening when the first Prussian columns appeared on the French right flank. Blücher had regrouped his battered army in under 48 hours and marched toward the guns. The force Grouchy was supposed to have neutralized was now arriving in strength. Napoleon committed his final reserve, the Imperial Guard, the soldiers who had never been broken in battle. They advanced up the ridge in precise formation as they had advanced 100 times before. Wellington's men, concealed behind the crest, stood and fired into them at close range. The guard faltered, then broke. The cry went through the French army like a crack through ice. The guard retreats. Within minutes, the retreat became a rout. Wellington advanced from the ridge. Blücher's cavalry swept in from the east. Napoleon, surrounded by the wreckage of his army, was carried off the field in the darkness. 9 hours of fighting had ended 23 years of almost continuous European war. The man who had remade a continent now faced something he had never truly confronted. There would be no negotiation this time, no Elba with its small comforts and its view of the sea. He surrendered to the British warship Bellerophon on the 15th of July, 1815, presenting himself with a theatrical formality that already suggested he was thinking about how the moment would be remembered. He had written to the Prince Regent comparing himself to Themistocles seeking refuge from his enemies. The British were unmoved. There would be no comfortable exile this time, no small kingdom to govern, no possibility of return. St. Helena was chosen precisely because escape was nearly impossible. A volcanic island in the South Atlantic, nearly 1,200 miles from the nearest coastline, windswept and damp, ringed by cliffs and patrolled by the Royal Navy. Napoleon arrived in October of 1815 and would not leave alive. His jailer, the Governor Sir Hudson Lowe, was humorless, suspicious, and petty. The two men despised each other immediately and comprehensively. Napoleon found the restrictions humiliating. Lowe found his prisoner manipulative and theatrical. Both assessments were largely correct. What Napoleon could not do with armies, he attempted with words. He dictated obsessively to a rotating cast of companions who had chosen exile with him, producing thousands of pages of memoir, commentary, and carefully constructed self-justification. He was not recording history so much as manufacturing it. The wars became defensive campaigns, forced on him by British aggression and continental jealousy. The executions and the censorship faded into footnotes. The legal reforms, the roads, the schools, the centralized administration moved to the foreground. He was, in his own telling, the true heir of the revolution, the man who had carried its principles across Europe at the point of a bayonet. He died on the 5th of May, 1821. He was 51 years old. The official cause was stomach cancer, though theories of arsenic poisoning have circulated ever since, sustained by genuine traces of arsenic found in preserved samples of his hair. Whether by disease or something more deliberate, the man who had survived Toulon and Austerlitz and Moscow was gone. The legend, however, was only beginning. The memoirs reached Europe and found an enormous audience. Within a generation, Bonapartism became a genuine political movement, eventually carrying his nephew Louis Napoleon to power as Emperor Napoleon III. Across Latin America, where his invasion of Spain had shattered colonial authority and ignited independence movements, his indirect influence ran deeper still. And quietly, without ceremony, the administrative and legal structures he had built continued operating long after the man himself was buried. The Code Napoleon, with its principles of equality before the law, property rights, and secular civil authority, survived in France, in Belgium, in Louisiana, in Quebec, in the legal foundations of dozens of nations that had never seen a French soldier. Here was the final paradox. The man who ended the French Revolution by seizing its power also spread the revolution's core ideas further and more durably than any of the idealists who had come before him. The artillery officer from Corsica had conquered Europe twice. Once with cannon, once with law. Napoleon's shadow still falls across the modern world, written into the legal codes of over 80 nations and the very idea that law should serve citizens rather than kings. Subscribe for more histories of the figures who shaped the world we inherited.